Ever since my young childhood, it has been the family knowledge, joke, inside secret, whatever that there is the ghost of a witch living in my maternal grandmother's upstairs level. My older cousin, who is now in her 30s, claims she remembers seeing the ghost of the witch as a child, and from then, even to this day, has petrified of the stairwell and will not go up for any reason. My slightly older cousin, who is now 20, says she has been terrified with stories of seeing the witch for years, but she, like myself, was slightly more curious about it. Then I, a few years younger than I, was raised with the same tales. So she and I used to climb the stairs together at night time with all the lights out in hopes of being able to confront this witch ghost. It had all started with my grandmother sometime in the 80s. My grandmother, my mother and her siblings, and my late grandfather moved into the 2-story house in the early 80s. The house was under new construction when they purchased the house. My mother often boasts of how she was the one who picked the house. She was a child at the time and thought the unfinished house was beautiful. My grandmother and grandfather considered her opinion and gave it a look and ended up purchasing it. My grandmother has always been a person who believes in the paranormal. In her younger days, she played around with things like the Ouija board and tarot cards, but was never avid about it, just light stuff. Her interest in such things, though, spawned from learning about the heritage of the females in our family. They had been witches killed during the Salem witch trials. In fact, one of the very last witch hangings was held about 5 minutes from my current home. My grandmother's mother was always accused by the whole family of being a witch. This accusation may have had something to do with the fact that she was heavily abusive to my grandmother when she was young, fed her rat poison, beat the life out of her on her wedding night, constantly emotionally abused her, etc. It has always been believed that her house was cursed. I only met this wicked woman about 3 times, and there was always something off about her. She could convince you that she was the sweetest old woman in the world and hide perfectly how abusive she was to her daughter and her husband. Naturally, when my grandmother found that we are descendants from witches, she considered the possibility of her mother being one more seriously. My grandmother moved her Ouija board and her tarot cards and her books about ghosts into this new house in the 80s, and only after a year or so did strange things begin to happen. My grandmother and my grandmother both remember the first occasion of something strange. My grandmother was carrying a laundry basket up the stairs, and suddenly she could no longer continue up. She said it felt as if someone was standing in front of her, forceful as a wall, and not allowing her to continue. She physically could not continue up the stairs. She said that the force felt cold and hot at the same time. My mother says she remembers my grandmother trying her hardest to push against it, but not being allowed through. My grandmother calmly said, "All right, let me through," and the force disappeared. It terrified my mother, and she said it was chilling how calm my grandmother was about it. My grandmother would often have her girlfriends over for tea, as her house is rather large, with 2 living rooms and decorative old-fashioned charm. And similar to a small mansion, she has quite a collection of tea and antique pots and cups. One tea party in the afternoon, though, would be the first visual sighting of the ghost of the witch. She was having tea with a few of her friends, all ladies, when one of the ladies looked up and over my grandmother's shoulder. She smiled at something behind her, then returned her eyes to my grandmother and asked, "Who is your other guest? I've never met her before." My grandmother thought someone else had showed, but she'd not invited anyone else. She turned around and saw that nothing was there. Her friends then began convincing my grandmother that they weren't crazy. They'd all seen her and described her as an old lady with long, wavy grey hair that's messy and a dirty dress, and with the saddest, most confused-looking expression on her face. Although she found it quite interesting, and she did believe her friends, she reigned still calm about this experience. Those girlfriends of hers suddenly no longer wanted to come over to her house anymore. My grandfather passed away, and several years later, my grandmother remarried. Neither of them ever experienced anything or felt anything off about the house. None of the men who ever entered the house felt or saw anything at all. Some of the men are skeptics and some are believers, but regardless, none of them ever saw anything. It seemed the ghost of the witch would only present herself to the women of the family or women visitors. Given her heritage, it would make sense. My grandmother, who is still haunted by this ghost witch, has never had an explanation as to why everyone began regarding her as the witch. She simply says that she felt the lady was a witch. My oldest cousin, the one who is now 30, was the second one to visually see this ghostly lady. She was a teenager at the time she saw it, about to be 20. She was alone in the house on Christmas night while everyone sat outside in the large garage. The family often sat out there when they smoked and spent hours there. My cousin claimed that she was going up the stairs to use the bathroom, too embarrassed to use the one on the first floor. She didn't feel like turning the light on, so she just carefully walked up, guided by the light of the downstairs Christmas tree. It was then that she said she saw an old woman with a sorrowful expression and long, wavy grey hair walked slowly past her at the top of the stairs. She walked away into the computer room, which was once my mother's bedroom. It's currently, and was, when my cousin had her experience, a room full of mirrors and antiques and my great-grandmother's belongings. My cousin said that the old lady walked to that room and she refused to climb the stairs and investigate. She ran out of the house, crying to her father that there was a ghost. He didn't believe her and laughed it off. She was plagued with nightmares for the longest time and currently refuses to go anywhere near the stairwell. After these occasions with the witch, she'd become a household name, and my older cousin and I were raised on the spooky tales. This was one of the many things that had embedded a fascination with the paranormal and morbid into my mind from a young age. My grandmother would tell only the young ladies of the house these stories, as the men thought she was crazy, regardless of the beliefs on the paranormal, simply because they'd never seen anything in the house. My grandmother told my older cousin and I the story of the night that one of her taxidermied birds came back to life for a few minutes. My grandmother and her new husband were both avid hunters and went duck hunting often, as well as fishing in ponds at night time. They had their best catch stuffed by a taxidermist and placed in the glass box. The stuffed bird sat atop on a cabinet in the computer room, the one the witch apparently walked to. She said that she and her husband were asleep one night when they were startled awake by a loud sound. The sound was of hundreds of birds chirping and screeching and flying. They thought that some birds had attacked their attic and gotten stuck inside, so that was the first place she checked. Nothing was inside, though, not a single bird. The sound continued, though, and it seemed to be coming from no specific place. She couldn't locate the sound. She went to open the computer room's door, and when she did, deafening silence fell over the house and not a single chirp was heard. She found the taxidermy bird on the floor, the glass box busted into tiny crystals on the floor. This story in the infamous witch story led my curious cousin and I to venture into the computer room as many times as we could. My oldest cousin called us crazy, but we called us brave and curious. We only liked to go up at night because it created a better ambience, and we felt we had a better chance of seeing something terrifying for ourselves. We played with antique mirrors, dug through old wooden trunks in search of my grandmother's Ouija board, and did ghost chants in witch spells that we found online. When that got boring and came with no results, we got on Microsoft Word. I'm talking old school with Clippy, the paperclip dude, and wrote murder mystery stories. We'd write the most gore-filled story we could imagine, then print it out on my grandmother's printer and hide several copies of it around the house to creep people out. Sometimes the very old desktop computer would take control of itself and start searching for things on its own. We witnessed it type in a series of confusing codes and numbers, then pull up various pictures of headstones and scroll quickly through them. We didn't scream and run out as our oldest cousin would have. We simply watched in silence. The computer abruptly shut off, and our only fear was that we'd get in trouble for breaking our grandmother's computer. The lights would turn on and off in the room, not as if flickering, though. They turned off and on dutifully, as if someone was doing it on purpose. Some sounds came from the floor like scratching and bumping, and the mirror always seemed to be in a different spot every time we turned around to look at it. Books fell off shelves, and the other newer computer kept on the other side of the room would fire up by itself, and stopped paying me any attention at all. We'd once been close, but her own social standards forced us apart, and she rarely spoke to me. She was rarely mean to me, but she acknowledged me only on holidays. She evolved into a preppy, popular girl, while I spiraled into a paranormal, obsessed young teenager who scoured the internet for gore and supernatural. And I still ventured on my own into the computer room upstairs. My fascination for the paranormal was deeper than that of my cousins. Hers had just been a phase. Mine had been my entire life. Both sides of my family believe in ghosts, and each have stories of their own experiences. The only skeptic, surprisingly, is my mother. She does admit, though, that she only doesn't believe because she tries not to, because she's scared to. My father, on the other hand, was my biggest supplier of creepy stories, and he always told me if you go looking for something, you'll find it sooner or later, because he knew how badly I wanted to explore ghosts, so I never stopped looking in my grandmother's house. My great-grandmother, nearly 102 years old at that time, was placed into a nursing home because her house couldn't be afforded, and all the money was going to the nursing home and the house to the state. There was an occasion where the family was invited to go collect some things from her house. Anything that we liked because they were going to get thrown away anyway. I went and took some creepy old dolls from the 20s, and my mother took some sentimental items. When I was in my great-grandmother's bedroom alone, staring into the large Victorian mirror of hers, chills rushed through me, and I leapt when I saw a shadow dart behind me. I turned around and searched for what had made the shadow, but the strong smell of garlic and burning wood dizzied me and forced me to leave the room. The presence felt sad and angry at the same time. My aunt, who had more business knowledge than any of us at the time, was helping my grandmother close the probate on the house. It was her job to keep the house in good condition, so she had to visit it alone frequently. On the last day of having to go inside, she went to take the one item that she had wanted from the estate, a vintage lamp that reminded her of her 70s childhood. She took the lamp and bid the house a relief farewell. She locked the house up behind her, and suddenly a massive bolt of lightning struck the yard just in front of her. The rain began to pour and the wind began to howl, blackened clouds bruising the sky above her and making a great rage of storm. She quickly tried to unlock the house, but the keys seemed to not even fit in the doorknob anymore, even though she just used it. The door opened on its own after she pulled the key away from it. She ran inside to shelter from the rain and sat the lamp down. She claimed she saw something run through the kitchen from the corner of her eye, and with the witch rumours about her wicked grandmother, decided to leave the lamp. She closed the door behind her, leaving the lamp. When she stepped out onto the front porch, the rain had stopped, and there wasn't even a breeze. The sky cleared, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. She still claims to this day that her grandmother's house was cursed. A few years later, my great-grandmother died. I attended the funeral, and my family makes jokes the whole time. My grandmother was hardly sad that this day had come, as she had had to take care of the wicked woman who abused her. She took care of her every need every day, from her 70th birthday until her death at 1 or 2. She was relieved, and when the funeral home workers apologized and gave condolences, we all looked at one another. My aunt, stepping out of the restroom while the big ivory casket was being rolled into the chapel, accidentally whacked it with the door and nearly knocked it over, nearly killing all of us as we struggled not to bust and to laugh her. It was the most humorous funeral I'd ever attended in my life. After her death, my grandmother was plagued with nightmares of her mother coming back to haunt her, or being trapped with her in the afterlife. One night she found her husband walking around the house with a shotgun in his hand. She asked him what he was doing, and he looked terrified. This was the first occasion when a man in the house had experienced something paranormal inside it. He was shaking, and he shouted to my grandmother that your mother is here. She begged him what he was talking about, and he explained, I smell her, I feel her. Your mother is here, don't you smell that? Her mother had always worn the same perfume, Elizabeth Taylor's White Diamonds. It was the only perfume she'd ever worn, and she used on herself heavily every day, sometimes twice a day. It was a scent that had sickened my grandmother's husband for the whole time he'd known the old lady. My grandmother recently tried to give us some of her mother's old jewellery because she wanted it out of her house so badly. She claimed it was cursed. I believed her. My aunt certainly believed her, and my older cousin, though so long separated from our experiences as children, refused to take the jewellery. I thought of taking it, but I already own a piece of jewellery that was passed down through the women of our family, through all the witches. It's a sapphire ring that saw several generations, and for reason I find more than coincidental, ended up with me. After my great-grandmother gave it to my grandmother, she gave it to my mother before I was born and said, "Give this to her." My mother didn't even know she was having me, a girl yet. She asked her mother how she could assume I was a girl, and my grandmother simply said, "Just give this to her." And well, here I am, a very paranormal type of girl wearing the witchy sapphire ring today. I haven't seen my oldest cousin in several years. The last time I saw her was at someone's funeral. She's a drug addict and she moved far away. My older cousin got married and moved away and hasn't given the paranormal a second thought. It seems now that her memories have been completely erased when the topic of the witch in the computer room are brought up. It's as if she's a different person. My grandmother's friends never come around anymore, and whether they admit it or not, it's because of that ghostly witch. My mother thinks that my grandmother and I are crazy, but it seems we're simply more sensitive to these types of things. Recently, my grandmother said that she was in the store when a short, polite old woman approached her. She was in an all-white robe, and she was shockingly pale, and she was friendly and exuded calm and happiness. She asked my grandmother to direct her to the exit, as she couldn't find it. When she was about to tell her where the exit was, the glowing white woman disappeared in the thin air. Nobody believes her but me. I have my own Ouija board, tarot cards, crystals, mirrors, antique objects, antique dolls, dowsing rods, EMF meters, and EVP readers. For about 3 years, I obsessively tried to contact one particular ghost, and it wouldn't surprise me if I opened the doors to something else in the meantime, especially when considering the lengths I've gone to. I still try to contact this particular ghost, and for now he only reaches out to me in my dreams. But if you go looking long enough, you're bound to find. I feel the need to share a story written from a viewpoint I don't often see here, that of a stalker himself. While I in no way want to give the impression that I believe my actions were in any way excusable, I think it's important for people to know how easily a shy young man's crush can explode into a full-bore obsession, and the precise events that cause this to happen, at least in my case. Although now, 10 years later, after the fact, I am well aware of the terrible things I was doing and thinking, but I want everyone who may hear or read this to know not all those who become stalkers are terrible people. They are simply lost. However, it is ultimately up to them whether they step out from the darkness in time to realize this is where they are dwelling. Please give me a little of your time to explain how badly I strayed and what it took for me to return to my former path. If I'm going to tell this tale properly, I should probably tell you about myself and the person I once was. My early childhood had been a happy one as far as I can recall. Nothing really bad started until I began adolescence, and my cute freckles were replaced almost completely by severe acne. With the acne came the seemingly unending bullying and mockery. At that age, no girl, regardless of her heart, wants to be seen with a school pizza face, and he knows this very well. The treatment I would receive for many years following caused me to become a far more introverted and angry young man, where I was once a shy but kind child. My only option at the time appeared to be keeping my head down and trying to make it through each day. Unfortunately, this was rarely the way things panned out. Any kid who was bullied as badly as I was could tell you this is often the way their day-to-day life was. It would turn out that as I entered my first year of college, no matter how bitter and jaded I had become, My heart made a choice. My mind certainly never would have. I want to stress that although my years at the university were far less offensive, the damage to my self-esteem had already been done. Despite this, I met a girl that stole my heart right away. The iciness of her light blue eyes and smooth porcelain skin were of a beauty I had never beheld, and still have not to this day. We had 2 classes together that first year, and I didn't learn a thing. Every bit of focus was on her, and before long she became involved in every thought of my day, and often even in my sleep. I would spend my free time beating myself up, telling myself that even if she treated me nicely, she would never want to be with me. My fears were made fact when I finally summed up the courage to ask her on a date. There was a dance being held for freshmen, and I had overheard her saying she hadn't been asked to accompany anyone yet. Some foolish notion I had conjured up told me that this was my chance to be with her. The next day between classes, I caught up to her and popped the question. The way in which she shot me down hurt me far more than I expected. By that time she was walking with a couple of other girls. Their laughing at my question cut me deeply, and when she suggested I ask someone else and that she would rather just be friends, well, I'll just say that her words cut me deeply. That night, as I sat in the dark in my dorm room, I cried and cursed myself for being so foolish, and cursed her even more. Then I think back on that night, it was where my obsession with her morphed from what I believed to be love into the early phases of hate. No matter how much I would tell myself that I hated her for what she had done, I knew I still would do anything to be with her, if even just for a moment. From that night on, and for a long time after, I would rant to any one of my few friends that would listen about how evil and bad females were, while at the same time I would follow her around obsessing about how beautiful she was any time they weren't around. The hypocrisy of what I was doing wasn't lost on me. However, I had already allowed my emotions to drive my actions. Soon just looking upon her wasn't enough, and I'd taken a step in a very scary direction. One afternoon I found myself alone in her dorm room. I'd managed to sneak in while everyone was gone to class, and because I'd made myself well versed in her and her roommates' coming and goings, I knew I had a good hour to myself. For several minutes I simply sat in her bed, taking in her surroundings and inhaling her wonderful scent on her sheets. Then I moved on to her drawers, pulling each one out in turn and burying my face in the clothing. Time flew by, and when my time was up, I quietly slipped out unseen. A few weeks after that, I took things even further and snuck in while she slept. The sick feeling of nervousness sat heavily in the pit of my stomach as the excitement of it all caused my heart to pound. I sat carefully onto her roommate's bed, who was out that night, and stared at her beautiful body. Her sleep was fit full, and the covers exposed her smooth, soft legs and backside. When I saw this, my heart pounded faster and faster. Terrible thoughts raced through my mind, but I grabbed control of myself and fled from the room before I leapt onto her. I quickly found myself becoming terrified of what I may do to her if I was alone with her again. Many days of battling the monster growing inside me, forced to make an important decision that would affect my future. One early morning I forced myself to go to the college mental health clinic and confess what I had been doing. At least twice I began to turn the doorknob and then stopped. The third time I succeeded. For the next year or more I would first attend an inpatient facility and then continue to see a shrink once a week. It took quite a while, but with a combination of time, separation and counselling, I was able to learn how to deal with my insecurities and obsessions. 10 years have passed since that early morning, and I'm proud of how far I've made it. Obviously, I never returned to the college, and that night in her room was the last time I saw her. While I may still at times find myself thinking back to that time, I no longer feel when he draw to her. I'm not sure if she ever knew the danger she was in, but I hope she is doing well and is happy. I've bounced from job to job for some time until I was lucky enough to befriend a man that gave me a job doing. Right at a small company. Come this September, I'll be there 6 years, and I'm doing very well. As a matter of fact, I was even able to meet a girl the normal way and get married. We're awaiting the arrival of our first child in the new year, and I couldn't be any happier. Looking back at the time and recounting such a terrible period here, I was, at first, unaware of exactly why I was sharing it with you and your listeners. Now that I've had some time to dwell upon it, I guess my goal is twofold. First, I want to give everyone present an idea of how someone can become an obsessed stalker, at least in my case, and how easy it is. Secondly, and most importantly, I want anyone who's reading or hearing this to know that you don't have to listen to what your obsessive mind is telling you. You can prevent yourself from doing something unspeakable and going past an unreturnable line. Not every stalker is a truly evil person. They may have simply lost their way and need a little help returning to the proper path. If you see yourself in the past version of me, don't be afraid to get help. All you have to do is ask. I live in a house on the cul-de-sac with my mom, 2 brothers and a roommate. I work 2 part-time jobs, one of which is in the same office my mum works at. She's a doctor and I work with medical records. I'm 20, my brothers who are twins are 17, my mum is 57, and the roommate is 18. We also live very close to a volunteer firehouse that blurs an extremely loud alarm when there is an emergency. Everyone within a couple of miles can hear the alarm. We're middle class and live in a modest house, but have a large front yard because our driveway is super long. 7 years ago we moved into our house and for a while everything was chill, until we found out about our crazy neighbour. We'll call Bob for privacy reasons. Bob has extremely paranoid schizophrenia and legitimately believes that the government is after him. He thinks that people are trying to brainwash him via microwaves, and he freaks out whenever he hears a plane pass by because he thinks they're after him. Whenever the firehouse blurs the alarm, Bob calls the police because he thinks someone is coming after him, and every time they have to tell him that he can't do that. He's also made some odd comments about one of my brothers as well. For a few years we didn't hear much from him until one day he sent a letter in the mail trying to sell us his baseball cards for $1 million. Apparently he sent the same letter to everyone else in the cul-de-sac. Everyone discarded the letters. All our neighbours are aware of Bob. They thought he was just a little crazy, but mainly harmless. We thought so too. We were wrong. Last winter we began to find mysterious footprints in the snow. It was a human's footprints across the front yard of the house. We knew it wasn't any of our footprints because none of us walked so far out into that part of our front yard like that. As I said earlier, our front yard is very large. We just shrugged it off as something odd. For a while Bob hadn't bothered us and we weren't thinking much of him at the time. Flash forward to a few days ago. Police were at Bob's house. Apparently he's being evicted. We kind of breathed a sigh of relief because he was weird but didn't think much of it. The next day after that was a normal day. Nothing odd. That was until Bob showed up at work. He began to rant to everyone about how he's in the military before going to my mum's secretary asking to have lab work done on him. This was raising a bunch of red flags because my mum never told him where she worked. Not only that, but to find my mum's secretary, you'd have to go back behind the main row of secretaries. Each doctor has their own secretary, and there are about 15 secretaries total each, with their own desk into a smaller area where a large printer is. My mum's secretary is in that smaller area, and it should be impossible for a stranger who hasn't been there before to know where she was. How did Bob know where to find my mum's secretary and ask for my mum despite not ever being there before and my mum never telling him her name? This freaked us out, and we decided to do some research on Bob. It turns out his dad was ex-military and that Bob owns a bunch of firearms. Bob's shady behaviour towards my mum and showing up at our work could only mean one thing. This man is stalking us and he is dangerous. At the very least, we have begun to suspect that he has been going through our mail. It was also likely that it was his footprints that were in the snow of our yard last winter. My mum got a peace order. It's kind of like a restraining order rather quickly, and then notified all the other neighbours about what happened. We thought maybe things would die down now, but nope. Today he was in the parking lot of work staring blankly at one of the secretaries. She said he was sweating and looked a little off. He didn't stop staring at her. He asked about my mum again. Everyone in the family is on edge. He has guns, has been stalking my mum at work and is being evicted. He doesn't have much to lose if he did some dangerous stuff to us. We notify the police and are making sure to lock the doors and install security cameras so that we can see if he comes onto the property again. No one is allowed home alone until the craziness stops, and until we know for a fact that we'll be safe.